If we can accept that, then he was likely anointed king around 1050 BC. Okay? It's a long time ago. All right. Finally, we're through that stuff. Let's go to the outline and Israel's need for a king. Chapters 1 through 7. The first 7 chapters of Samuel give us a picture of the ministry of Samuel against the backdrop of great evil during a very pivotal period of Israel's history. It was the end of the period of the Judges again. A period of widespread spiritual rebellion and apostasy, during which we are told, in those days Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. And I preached 2 weeks ago about Gideon. Gideon was one of the judges. Samson was one of the judges. You didn't have to be a spiritual person to be a judge, as Samson attests readily, doesn't it? You know who Samson was, right? I mean, Samson had some real issues with sexuality. So, some of the judges a little questionable in character. But anyway, we're told that during the period of the Judges, in those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. Everyone did his own thing. Now, there is a clear contrast between the righteousness of Samuel's family and that of Eli and his wicked sons, who were the priests of the tabernacle at Shiloh. There's also a description of the early wars between Israel and the Philistines, which shows the importance of Samuel's ministry. So let's move down to the Shiloh narratives in chapters 1 through 3. The birth of Samuel. Okay? Now, the story of Samuel begins with a very common motif in the Old Testament, that of an infertile woman. I was just reading in Time magazine about, there's almost, have you ever heard of surrogate mothers? And there's almost a cottage industry in India for surrogate mothers. They have like baby factories there. I don't know if you read Time magazine, but it's really interesting. You have so many mothers that can't conceive; they're infertile, and so they have surrogates, and so they have these whole hospitals that are filled with surrogate mothers. I mean, I didn't know this, but I thought it was fascinating. You have these poor women, and they make a few $1,000s by being a surrogate mother, and so they do it. But that was a very, very common motif in the Old Testament. You remember Sarah, the wife of Abraham? She was infertile. Rebecca, Jacob's wife, the same problem. Samson's mother. All of these people struggled with infertility. And the sons of these women would turn out to be key figures in the story of God's redemption, though. In the New Testament, we're told of another woman, Elizabeth. She was also infertile. And who was her son? John the Baptist. Yeah. She gave birth to John the Baptizer. Okay, let's move down to the background of Hannah and her problems. Verses 1 through 8 of chapter 1. It's important for us to realize how important children were in ancient Israel for preserving and developing this largely agricultural society. Children, particularly males, were necessary as heirs and also as labor for both agricultural and household duties. Also, we need to realize that in the ancient Near East, fertility was associated with divine blessing. And infertility was considered to be a divine curse. Now, in our culture today, some couples choose not to have children. I have a son and his wife, and they have chosen not to have children. I have 2 other sons and their wives, and they have, they each have 2. So we have grandchildren, and we're very, very happy for that. And they're going to be coming down today, by the way. We're going to meet them up in Lake Buena Vista and spend a week with them. I will be back next week, by the way. And we're going to go to Legoland for the first time. So she's going to get a little scooter because she can't walk very far. But anybody been to Legoland? Okay, well, we're going to go. So anyway, they're the right ages for it, 3 and 5. So I'm sure they're going to have a great time. But choosing not to have children in the Near East would have been unthinkable to a woman back then. One commentator even writes, in the ancient mindset, having children was close to the very reason for a woman's existence. The well-being of women was attached directly to their children who could look after them after the death of a husband. Now, keep in mind that there was no national social security system that cared for widows and orphans. In fact, if you go back 100 years ago, we didn't have a social security system in this country. And on a personal level, fertility was a matter of honor for these women. And persistent infertility shamed them. In the ancient social setting, the most important role for a wife was to bear children. So when we read in verse 2 of chapter 1 that Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none, and then in verse 7, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. I mean, we can fully understand her shame and embarrassment, can't we? I mean, Hannah couldn't have children, and there was not an hour or a day that Peninnah wouldn't let her forget that. You ever have somebody like that? That, it's just, she just kept after her. She kept, to make matters worse, she just kept rubbing it in. You can't have children. Now, as already mentioned, when our story begins, we're introduced to Samuel's father, Elkanah, who had 2 wives. Now, this was not uncommon in Old Testament times. Remember that polygamy was accepted. It was also legal according to Israelite law. If you don't believe me, look at Deuteronomy 21, verses 15 to 17. One of the main reasons for taking a second wife in that culture was that the first wife was infertile. And so in this instance, it's likely that this was the case. As we're told that his other wife, Peninnah, had children, but Hannah had none. And so even though Hannah was Elkanah's first wife, her status in the family was very, very precarious due to the fact that she was infertile. And so in that culture, a barren wife was usually afforded a lower status if she wasn't divorced altogether. Now, under the law, you could divorce a wife. There were ways that you could do that. You could just, it was a whole lot easier than we could do it today. But we're told in verse 5 that Elkanah loved Hannah and gave her a double portion because of that. So the fact that she was infertile, he gave her a double portion, whatever that means. Now, Elkanah, the husband, is presented here in this chapter as a devout worshiper of Yahweh. And I will sometimes use the word Yahweh. That's the Hebrew word for God. And you got to get that in there. Yahweh. We have a Jewish family in our neighborhood. They have a dog. It doesn't bark. He just goes. Elkanah is a devout worshiper of Yahweh. He's from the northern tribe of Ephraim. And we see this from his yearly trips to worship and sacrifice at Shiloh, which was about a 15-mile trip or a 2-day journey back in those days. Shiloh was an important worship sanctuary from the early days of the settlement of the land. According to Joshua 18:1, the tent of meeting was set up there in Joshua's day, and likely was the primary sanctuary for Israel during the period of the Judges. There was no Jerusalem yet. At least it was not the city of David yet. Okay? So, if you wanted to worship God, Shiloh was the place. And yet, despite Elkanah's love for Hannah, their household is not a happy one. Because of Hannah's infertility, there's bitter hostility between the wives. There's a tremendous rivalry. Also from his comments in verse 10, let's see here, verse 10. In bitterness of soul, Hannah wept much and prayed to the Lord. It appears that he's a bit clueless as to Hannah's feelings of self-worth. He doesn't seem to understand how this is affecting her. So, we come to Hannah's prayer in chapter 1, verses 9 through 18. While at the Lord's temple for the festival at Shiloh, Hannah weeps and prays earnestly. She makes a vow to Yahweh. Her years of infertility have convinced her that any child born to her would have to be nothing short of miraculous and a gift from God. And so she makes a vow to return such a gift to God forever. She promises that no razor will ever be used on his head, which would indicate that this was a Nazirite vow. Apparently, if you want to read about that, the background would be Numbers chapter 6. Apparently, Samson was also a Nazirite. The vow was one of special separation unto God. In most cases, it was for a specific period of time in which the Nazirite abstains from wine and other products of the vine, uses no razor on his head, and this was not a hard one, avoids contact with dead bodies. I mean, not that anybody would want to, would you? You might, not want to forego your glass of wine, but, I don't mind, the dead body part was really easy. And after a period of separation was over, Numbers chapter 6 prescribed a ritual for terminating the vow. Interestingly, in the cases of both Samson and Samuel, the vow appeared to have been permanent, not temporary. And so apparently Hannah is offering her unborn child as a permanent Nazirite, whose life would be devoted exclusively to God. Now, side note here. Hannah's dedication of Samuel is often used to justify the so-called dedication of infants instead of baptism, infant baptism, okay? What we see here in 1 Samuel 1 has nothing to do with that practice that we sometimes see in Bible churches or Baptist churches. In fact, in the church where I grew up in Maryland, infant dedications were commonly done. And, I saw this year after year. And Hannah's dedication of young Samuel was used as justification. And I often thought, that has absolutely nothing to do with what's going on here in 1 Samuel. These people are not giving up their child to go, live in the temple or whatever. Now, in the Reformed tradition, of which Presbyterians are a part, we practice the baptism of infants as the logical New Testament extension of circumcision. So, anyway. One more observation. Eli, the priest, represents the corrupt and apostate leadership of the priesthood of the dismal period the judges in the history of Israel. And Hannah represents the simple faith that comes out of suffering and pain. Eli mistakes her prayer for drunkenness. Now, I don't know about you, but this may be that it may be saying that perhaps drunkenness was not uncommon in Shiloh, given the horrible behavior of his two sons. Have you met his two sons yet? Hophni and Phinehas? Goodness gracious. And it may have something to say about the spiritual insensitivity of Eli. I don't know. But the supreme irony here, and I think we're going to close with this, is that the spiritual leader of Israel, the high priest, Eli, was unable to recognize the spiritual significance of this woman's struggle. She comes to him for help, and he thinks she's drunk. I mean, that's sad to me. And it's ironic. I mean, do you see the irony there? And then finally, Eli blesses her request. Now, I think we need to stop there, and we didn't get as far as I wanted to get, but do we have any questions? Any questions or comments? Usually Lawrence Widener will have something to say, and he's not here. He will, yeah, Jamie.
Do you have any insight into why the books of Gad and Nathan are referenced but not included in the Bible?
Well, we have a lot of books that are mentioned that are mentioned in the Bible. For example, 2 Corinthians. We don't have that book. Actually, the book that we have, if you were in Corinthians when we did 1st and 2nd Corinthians, you'll know that we have 1 Corinthians, and the book that we have that's called 2 Corinthians was actually 3rd Corinthians. That 2 Corinthians was actually lost. There may be more letters, and there may be other books that, there are a lot of books that are mentioned in the Book of Kings, for example, that are not, we don't have them as canonical scripture. And all I can say is that God in His sovereignty did not include them. That's actually above my pay grade. Anyone else? Okay, I know that today we probably went into a lot of technical stuff that maybe is not very interesting to some of you. Are we on? Am I doing this the right way? Am I teaching this the right way? Enough detail? Too much detail?
Enough. Just right. It's good.
Okay. Just give me some feedback, because I will get it at home, believe me.